Lama Zopa, I think of him as the supreme of mothers. So his voice is like a lullaby. No, I'm joking. We have to concentrate. So there's some point in the transcript where he says, now the method to stop that. So if the people who are operating the screen can find that point, it's right at the end of the section on talking about his early life and this dream about flying or something. And then he says, if your body's burned by fire, going to the south, south is where the Lord of Death, Shinji is abiding. So you have a dream, you're traveling south, that's considered to be an inauspicious dream. Riding donkey or camel, those are bad signs. No, it's before that. Was it? Is that it? You got it. So now the method to stop that, including the inauspicious dreams. So what we're talking about stopping. So what's the point of all this emptiness talk? So that's going to be the subject of my talk. What comes next, which is to talk about emptiness. So, like we have to set our motivation, why we're doing this. So then we have to think about what's the point. So the point is removing our suffering, of course. So if we could flip to the Four Seals chant verses. The nuns who are operating the screen. And there's one verse says, when life runs through the fingers. So it's the first verse of the second column on the first page. Can't turn around. Yeah, so just a very quick review of why we should you can go into this real headache of the subject of emptiness. Renunciation. So, when life runs through the fingers like dry sand, all the worldly hopes and fears, the plans we lay, sand castles circled by the lapping tide, birth, aging, sickness, death, what more to say? So there you go, translators. You've got to translate verse now. Unprepared. Sorry. But maybe a little commentary will help. British kids, I'm born in England, and the delight of our summer was to go to the seaside. The seaside holiday was, the traditional English holiday. So we so looked forward to it. You get out on those big beaches and, you start playing with the sand. And when it's dry sand, how it runs through the fingers. We've all done that. We've probably all been to the beach. And, how long ago that seems now. I mean, I can remember it as if it was yesterday. But, your mind has to cast way, way back to pick that memory up, So life indeed runs through the fingers like dry sand. All worldly hopes and fears, the plans we lay, they're like sandcastles that you build on the edge of the water. The tide is coming in. So I and my two brothers, we all had to build a sandcastle and put a little stick upright on top of the sandcastle. Okay, sandcastle. Yeah? Well, there's translators here, and I know how difficult a job that is. So the tide's coming in, but you've got to build a sandcastle. You each have, you set a time limit, 5 minutes or something. So then the tide comes in inevitably, the lapping tide. It's going to destroy everything you've done in this life. And, the one who had the stick sticking up on their sandcastle the longest, the tide comes in, the waves lap at the sandcastle and gradually destroys it. So the one who's got the stick left sticking up on the sandcastle, they're the winner, all right? My brothers, me. So that's exactly it, isn't it? Sandcastles circled by the lapping tide. Birth, aging, sickness, death. What more to say? And that doesn't just, in modern times hugely expands the possibilities of meditating on impermanence. So as the individual, you and I, our individual birth, aging, sickness, and death. But then there is the birth, aging, sickness, and death of a society, of a civilization. And then there is a birth, aging, sickness, and death of a species. So we're in this little bit of a time now where those things become extremely obvious. All those civilizations that have gone to ruin, where's our civilization heading? Our society? And I think sometimes it's just like, the Tibetans up in those crucial years before 1959 when the Chinese invaded. Nothing they could do about it. The Chinese armies were, heading for Tibet, if you knew. So you just have that little interlude, when the catastrophe is looming. So, climate change, climate oscillation. Okay, translators, oscillation. A fancy word for change. Yeah, it's got a bit unstoppable. So impermanence gets easier and easier to meditate on if you are just aware of what's happening. But it's not just to see that this present life in worldly terms is fruitless, but it's to get at why it's suffering in the first place. So this is where the meditation on emptiness is going to come in. So Lama Zopa is saying, that phrase we've just had here, now the method to stop that. So we find out what the cause of that suffering is. So the next verse of the Four Seals chant is, the glories of this world disfigured by its causal flaw, the worm within the bud. What's flung by karma, from affliction sprung, brings suffering assured, no lasting good. So now we're drilling in, now we're investigating the causes of that, suffering. Mother Earth, she's so generous, but there are limits, So why is this glorious world going to let us down? Why does it always let us down? Why has it let us down from beginningless time? Well, it's disfigured. You know what I mean? It's like made ugly, by there's some defect in the cause. So when there's a defect in the cause, the effect isn't going to turn out all nice and 100% beautiful and wonderful. So the defect in the cause we're talking about is, this beautiful world is flung by our collective karma. And our, so our individual experience and our collective experience, and it's not just any old karma, it's contaminated karma. Difficult to explain what that means. But that's where emptiness comes again. It's like contaminated by a kind of a grasping at self. Even if you do a virtuous action and you're not don't know how to motivate and dedicate, then okay, it ripens up as happiness, but it only ripens up as that temporary happiness in cyclic existence, which is just like the sandcastle circled by the lapping tide. It's just going to get washed away, however happy it was. So, in the end, these temporary, surfacings of happiness, but then looking at the whole process from, a little bit of a wiser perspective, you see that all this brings suffering assured, no lasting good. Okay, so that's why we've got to get out of it. And how do we get out of it? Well, we have to in Lama Zopa's words, we have to recognize the dream as a dream. We have to recognize the hallucination as a hallucination. So that's just a little bit further down, a few lines further down from the quote about the method to stop that. Yeah, so that's the problem. We aren't seeing things correctly. Yeah, so we're kind of all confused. So then we try to do good actions, but that they never produce good effects which are fulfilling and lasting in any abiding sense. So we talked about karma. So what drives us into our unskillful actions, whether they are blatantly negative actions or whether they are, our attempt at virtuous action. What drives us to do those actions? Well, our motives will be various. And if we're trying to do good actions, we're not necessarily thinking of our desire to help others as being an affliction. No, I'm not saying that is. We can have virtuous states of mind. But right at the root, we've got this self-grasping. Right at the root, we've got this wrong way of grasping ourselves and things to exist. And that's the affliction which accompanies even the virtuous action of somebody who's in the samsaric state. So it all gets a bit confusing, and how to describe that. So this root ignorance is a self-grasping ignorance. Even beginners, I hope, have heard of that phrase, self-grasping ignorance. So I've tried to describe it. Maybe we can go back to the Four Seals verses. Page 2, first verse on page 2. As if a nature. So this is going to be tough for your translators. No, above that. Is that your page 2? No, it's above that one. As if a nature from itself. Yeah, that's it. So this is trying to, pinpoint the objective negation, the technical word, the objective negation for those older students. So, what is the wrong grasping then? What is the ignorance grasping at that so delivers us into so many problems? So, it's when we look at ourselves or look at other things. It's we seem to see there the object, ourselves or the other, as it's as if that object has a nature from within itself, and that a literal translation from the Sanskrit is like own being. It seems to have own being. It seems to have its own mode of existing by way of its own power. Own being, that which by its own power is there. So you look at your watch, and you think, well, unless it had some way of being a watch from the side of the watch, how could it ever, how would it ever be a watch unless it had a power of being a watch from within, from its own side? It's got to have, a nature of its own, sort of guaranteeing that it is a watch from its own side, Some kind of watch DNA or something. Watch DNA, translators, you got it? Yeah, but it doesn't. That's the whole thing. That's the whole point. It doesn't have that. But we look at it as if it has that, and not just through some intellectual wrong teaching. Not just we've gone to somebody who's given us the wrong idea, but this is an instinctive thing. It just comes like with part of the package of being born in samsara, being born human. But this is what's identified as the problem. Fixating on a self like this is sheer delusion. And when you're under the grip of that delusion, then reason chokes. You want to be reasonable, you want to think carefully, but your reason's choked off. And instead, you're boiling over with passion and anger. So that's really, this is really the first stage of what we've got to think about. That's like Lama Zoba saying it's all like a dream. If you can realize that it's like a dream, then you're not caught up. You can say, this is only a dream. But when you're in the middle of it, when your passions are aroused, it's not like that, is it? And each of us has to meditate or, recollect our own individual circumstances and say, how did it happen that I got so angry? And then, only in that way do you start to see what the problem is, the root problem. And you can only talk from your own experience, really. So I have to talk about myself again. I don't really want to do that, but, as I say, these things have to be very personal. And I spent quite a few years looking after my father and my mother in the very last stages of their life. And, while my dad still had his legs, he could still go to the shops and, he could still do part of the bits of things around the household. Like, I could sort of lock myself away in my study and, and research into my text. But as the time went on and he became more and more feeble, every time he goes to the bathroom, you're accompanying him, shower, and so it gets, he was a great dad, there's no problem about that. He was a lovely dad, so I've got no justification whatsoever. Some people did have punishing experiences from their parents, so that's a different matter. But I didn't. My dad was a wonderful dad. But they get decrepit, right? We'll all get like that if we don't die soon. So, at some point you lose control. You blow a fuse or something, and you get really angry because you're messing about in the bathroom for 2 hours or something. You know what I mean? I'm not the only one who's had that experience. Many people here. But how dare you get angry with your own father? Who's, he's the one who took us on those seaside holidays. He's the one, if you really begged him and begged him and begged him again, he would buy you an ice cream. Oh, we can't afford that. But then, eventually, he buys you one. So he's a fantastic dad. But when you are in the situation of being angry with him, it's like you're despising him. You have to put him on a lower level than you. Isn't it? When you get angry with somebody, how do you have to see them? You have to see them as being despicable. You have to see them as being low and pathetic. So it's just like as if he really is some pathetic creature from his own side. You have to forget about, he was so wonderful to me, and he was a really good father, and he really was a Buddha, to me. You've got to see your parents as Buddhas, right? And he was a Buddha to me. He was actually a lighting engineer, a public lighting engineer for city street lights. So really, he was the Lord of Light, He was the Buddha of boundless light, Amitabha. Lighting the whole city, especially at Christmas time, with all the Christmas trees. No, really. When you're struggling in a difficult situation with him, it's completely the opposite. You've taken away all that memory of all the good things he did for you. You've got to put that away and not remember that. And then, he's old. He's got, his legs have worked very well for 95 years. But now, 96, 97, his legs are giving way. Well, wouldn't yours? And then, his brain has worked so well for, 94, 95 years. But now his brain is like, corroded or something. he was always able to recognize me. He was always able to. He wasn't one of those horrific cases of parents who really, don't even remember their own children. He wasn't like that. But dementia was, kind of, sandcastle circled by the lapping tide. The tide of dementia creeps in for the best of people if they live that long. And so, but you have to forget all that too. You have to see that person as really as if he's instinctively useless. And then you can shout at him and say, "You useless fool." You see what I mean? Only by forgetting the dependently arisen nature of the situation and the relationship, which is always there, whoever it is, only by forgetting all that can you get angry with your own loving father. You see what I mean? So this is, you're grasping your father to exist from his own side, by his own power, and then you can say, oh yeah, so he really is useless. He really is a pathetic waste of my time. And then you shout at him, even loud enough for the neighbors to hear. So isn't that how it happens? That's the only way it can happen. Only by forgetting the dependent arisings can you fall prey to those passions like lust and anger. So reason chokes. The reasoning is it's a dependent arising. He's useless because he's got dementia. And who wouldn't have dementia at that age, Am I even going to be able to live to that age? There's so many reasons why you wouldn't get angry, if you can think about them. And those are the reasons about the dependent arisings, you see what I mean? So that's what we have to balance. That's what we have to keep contrasting. What is the wrong way we are seeing things? Why does Lama Zopa say this is all a hallucination, all a dream? Because you're grasping things to have this inherent nature. It really is beautiful, supremely bad, really bad, supremely good. Because it's good or bad from its own side, because it exists from its own side, and all its qualities, they are from the side of the object, not from the side of your, fanciful mind imposing those qualities on the object. They're from the side of the object. Your dad really is useless, and the word that we use often is that things are inherently existent. Things are as if inherently existent. So that's a word you have to think about. That comes in the verse just below. We lack inherent being. That's the dream verse, you see. I'm reading that one now. Misgrasping, wrong attention, lust and hate. We're lost within the fictions of a dream. That's exactly Lama Zopa's point, the experiential talk he gave. Blind alleys of self-pity, selfishness. It all comes back to me. I'm so important because I exist from my own side. But then the next question is, well, how do we get out of this dream? How do you realize the dream's a dream? How do you realize the hallucination's a hallucination? So then we go on to this. So how to know things are not what they seem. So then, how do we do that? If you're lost within a dream or a hallucination, how do you know you're dreaming? How do you work out that you're hallucinating? So that's a challenge. Well, you could take magic mushrooms, expand your mind. You could have a near-death experience. That helps some people. No, really. People go along in the job, think their life's just this material thing, and my car and my house are so important, but then they have a near-death experience, they have a heart attack. And then they're revived, and so they've been to some, been right to the border of an undiscovered country where things are entirely different. Yeah? You've read about near-death experiences. Yeah? So like my dad, he was the Lord of Light, I said, but the light that he was providing is just, hydrocarbon-powered light. Yeah, coal runs the power stations, and fossil fuel runs the power stations, and they do produce light. But it's only a certain kind of light. That's the samsaric light, and there's a price that has to be paid. We've overspent our budget, right? We've overspent. Deep overdraft. But then you have one of these near-death experiences, which I've never had, no. But then you realize, there's another kind of light, the light of love or something, which transcends everything else. So that's the clean fuel that the universe should be running on, is it? Love! Never mind these hydrocarbons. Well, isn't it? No, and you yourself, you run on hydrocarbons. Yeah, what's the food we eat, the rice that we eat, or the potatoes that we eat? It's carbohydrate, right? It's just carbon, hydrogen molecules in a different form from what we put in a motor car, but it's the same deal. We are deriving our energy from, a very sort of polluting form of fuel. But that's the way samsara is. There'll always be drawbacks. But if you have a deeper experience in meditation, let's say, but for ordinary people who don't meditate, that experience might come when they have a heart attack and they find themselves in hospital revived. There are many stories. So that's another way you might wake up from the slumber of your ignorance. Just say, well, what's the problem here? Love's the answer. Clean fuel. Well, isn't it? That would have to be the fuel that the universe should run on. Because any attempt you say, well, why can't we fix this world by, devious things like, you make a veil over the sun so that the sun's heat is less strong, geoengineering or something they call it, trying to, halt or slow down the climate crisis. But they're all like, none of them are attacking the root problem. And so let's hope that love is the light of the world then. Let's work towards that. But for many of us, the light of understanding begins to dawn about, the uselessness of samsara. Oh, it's because of my selfishness. It's because of my self-centeredness. It's because of my self-grasping. That's the problem, really. So that dawns, when the Lama tinkles his little bell. Yeah? So we meet the spiritual guide. Ting, ting, ting. So, we also have good karma. So that also ripens. So we meet the teacher. And what does the teacher teach us? He teaches the path of reasoning. At least in this school. And the reasoning is, we lack inherent being. Yeah? We lack inherent being. So now we try to challenge that ignorance. That ignorance is grasping that your father just exists from his own side and just totally useless ornament, How much better my life would be if you weren't there, type of thing. It's vicious, but you have to, you have to admit that it happens like that. So actually, we lack that inherent being. We lack that way of existing purely by our own power. Since we are not inherently one with, nor different from, our aggregates, like bicycle and parts. Through contemplating this may insight come. So that's where Lama Zopa goes to. He talks about the self and the aggregates. I'll come to Lama Zopa in a minute then. But let's just get this reasoning clear for those people who are, coming from a sort of more beginner's perspective. So we say we lack inherent being. So this inherent word would be difficult even for most English people. You ask them what that word means, and they'll sort of have only a vague idea. And never mind if you're a person for whom English is a second language. But in ordinary use, in ordinary speech, whether before we get onto philosophical connotations, it may mean something like what? The one that always comes back to me is when the United States and Great Britain, the politicians are trying to whip up a frenzy of public feeling. So we've got to destroy Saddam Hussein. You remember the Gulf Wars? Yeah. So Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait from Iraq, and then the Americans stepped in, pushed him back. First one, yeah, but the second one, we're going to invade your country and depose you. Second Gulf War or whatever, I don't know what the official name is. We're all probably old enough to remember that, are we? Or is that lost in the mist of time now? But they're saying, what the idea was, I suppose, to get the oil reserves of Iraq for us, get the oil reserves of Iraq and get them for the US, and maybe a little bit for Britain if the United States were feeling, like throwing a piece of meat to their dog or something. So who was getting the profits from the Arab oil before the Americans stepped in? Well, I don't know. Was it France, probably, or Russia? No, isn't that true? I'm a bit vague about that, but it might have been France or Russia. So that's the whole point of the exercise. But in order to, because they had Saddam Hussein presumably under control, he wasn't making weapons of mass destruction anymore, actually. But I'm not going into politics. I'm not criticizing, people. I'm not taking political sides. That would be entirely wrong. But what I'm pointing at is, they said, look, we've got to destroy that guy. He's inherently evil. Yeah? So they tried to conjure up Saddam Hussein in the public imagination as being a monster, who's like so evil, all you can do is destroy them. Just like you'd spray onto a fly on your windscreen or the window of your house. You hate having flies in your house. They're so unhygienic. So we've got to destroy Saddam Hussein like that. So the propaganda was, Saddam Hussein is inherently evil, so just monsterify him, make him into a monster. So that's, he's just evil right from within himself, right from his own side. So that's the meaning of inherent that you've got to think about when you're trying to, penetrate what's going on here, ignorance versus wisdom. The ignorance grasps at things to inherently exist, and the wisdom comes along and say, hey, that's completely illogical, man. Just like with my dad, if you remember the dependent arising of the situation, you can never get angry. It might be necessary to take strong measures. I'm not saying it might be necessary to, do especially if you are a politician, it might be necessary to do, take strong action, which it might involve calling your armies. I don't know. I'm not a politician, and their decisions that they have to make are fraught with difficulty. But you don't do it out of anger and bitterness. You don't do it out of unreason. You don't do it when your reason's choking. You don't do it just with a lust for, the other person's resources to appropriate them for your own civilization. Because that only ends in tears, The karmic right results of that are just fatal. So, Lama Zopa, in the midst of his his talk about these things, did use at one point points about the aggregates, and he did use points about. He said the self and the aggregates are different but not separate. What did he say? I can't remember that one. I didn't have time to prepare everything here, so. Yeah. Yeah, so this verse is relevant here. Oh, good, yes. Yeah, so you have to know how to read these verses. So maybe we could go to the point in the verses, in the transcript by Lama Zopa, where he does quote from Nagarjuna. And somewhere here you've got the whole quote written in. Somebody's already identified the quotation and put it into the transcript, which is very helpful. Denjung Rowa Jungwa Kang, Deni Tomben Yidushes, Deni Tene Takpade, Deni Ume Lamyanos. Have you found that? Yeah. So that's at some point Lama Zopa brought this in to explain. And why not? Nagarjuna is the founding father, or the person who brings the middle way view and the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras back into, the public eye. Buddha, of course, taught all these things, but somehow in the first few hundred years of the Buddha's teachings, they lay low. They kind of lay non-manifest. They were like just stuck in the library and nobody was reading them. But Nagarjuna brings all these things back into play with devastating effect. So the other document we haven't looked at yet, it's got a translation of that, isn't it? So that's chapter 20, verse 18, was it? No, chapter 24, verse 18. Is that what it says? What is dependently arisen? Yes. So that's translation. This comes in the chapter on the Four Noble Truths, chapter 24, verse 18. What is dependently arisen? Just that is voidness, it is taught. Dependent imputation, that itself is just the middle way. So have a go at that, translators. Can you figure that one out? What is, in fact, a dependent arising? Just that is emptiness. Or if you're translating it to make it more understandable, you would say just that is empty. So your reasoning is, the reason you're putting to yourself is it's dependently arisen. So that's all phenomena. You, the other person, the material things of this world, samsara, nirvana, Buddha, your parents, yourself, your feelings, whether it's impermanent or permanent, they're all dependently arisen. In what sense? Well, they might be dependent on parts. They might be dependent on causes. They might be dependent on opposites. Short depends upon long, doesn't it? And then the one that keeps coming up in the prayer somewhere, you know, is it something like the negative action? The agent, the doer of the negative action, and the negative action itself? And the karma that you create. Is that the three? Anyway, you can have three, you can have four, you know, or if it's a virtuous action, you know, the giver, the agent who gives, the act of giving, the object that you give, and then the recipient to whom you give the gift. So you can have four there. So they're all mutually like, how could you have one without the other? How can you have a singer without a song? How can you have a goer without the action of going? Type of dependent arising, which Nagarjuna talks about a lot actually, if you get into his verses. You know, you imagine somebody walking up the aisle here, they're walking out of the prayer hall. Okay, so that's the person who's going, but you're not going to have a person who's going unless you have an action of going. So the person is easy to visualize. The act of going is a little bit more sort of abstract, isn't it? The action of going, the act of going. What does that look like? But we know what he means, right? Yeah, if I'm to be a goer, I have to be going. So I have to be performing the act of going. And am I the act of going? No, nobody would say, I am the act of going. That wouldn't make sense, would it, in ordinary English? And nobody says the act of going is the person who's going. So they've definitely got to be different. But they cannot be separated. So one will always depend upon the other. So immediately, like right there, you've got a sense in which you cannot possibly exist from your own side. The goer cannot possibly be a goer just by way of their own power. Yeah, the goer, the one who is going, the walker, yeah, the driver, the galloping horse, the goer. And it looks to the ordinary eye of the simple person that thing is doing that action just by way of its, you know, that thing is there, let's say, just by way of its own power. But when you investigate, well, you say there's no goer without an action of going. So immediately, you know, the mind is separated into two things. There's the goer and the action of going, legitimate separation. You know, the conceptual mind has to separate things in order to understand them. It has to put things into categories. That's its way. You know, how else do we learn anything when we're kids? We have to learn what categories things go in. Yeah? So there's no shame in saying, oh, well, it's all non-conceptual. Why are you bothering with this conceptual kind of, you know, gross level? It's the starting point. So there's no goer with the action of going. So obviously the goer depends upon the action of going. So how do you adjudicate? How do you decide, is she a goer or not? Or is he a goer or not? Well, is she doing the action of going? And if they are doing the action of going, then they're a goer. No, not otherwise. So it's like immediately, if you just try to concentrate on that with all the sort of purification that you've done for the last few days, and all the merit, incredible merit we've gathered, you know, and the blessings of the gurus are like piling in there, your mind becomes refined and lifted up to a lighter state, so you can think, oh yes, when I look for the goer existing from their own side, they're just not there. There's a sheer absence of a goer existing from their own side. Think about that. Am I all right for time? How much longer have I got? And I can go on till 12? Yeah. Okay, so we've got a little time to think now. Too many words, we'll spoil it all. So we're not talking about the contrast between aggregates, self and aggregates, which Lama Zopa was talking about, sorry. But this is definitely a Nagarjuna classic argument, and it's well worth, trying to let it open up to your mind. So you think goer, walker, rider, mover. Then you think, yes, but there's no goer without an action of going. And incidentally, there's no goer without somewhere that's being gone over. Yeah, if you are walking from here to the entrance or the exit of the tent, then that's your path. Yeah, so there's some ground that you're going over. But not to worry about that, I'm just mentioning it. So you've got the goer and the action of going. So first of all, when the goer comes to mind, you just think, that's just somebody walking out of the tent, right? Well, it's me walking out the tent. So you don't question about how it exists. Does it exist inherently? Does that person exist from their own side? But in the unquestioning mode, they will appear to as if existing from their own side. Everything will appear like that. That's the fate of being caught in cyclic existence. Our ignorance is so deep that things appear to be inherently existent, even to our sense consciousnesses, our I consciousness. But then play with it, say, well, now, there is no goer without an active going. So there's no goer without something it depends upon. And in this case, we're talking about the action. There's no goer without the action of going. And there's no action of going without a goer. Look at it like that. So just think about that for a moment. So that argument is one of Nagarjuna's favorites. So you just look at yourself ordinarily going, or some other person, you imagine them walking or watch them walking. Yeah, and at first glance they just look like they are just doing it. They're just existing from their own side like that, as a goer. But then you bring in the reason of dependent arising of our but. There is no goer without an action of going. So then you have to get familiar with that argument. You have to play with it in your mind. You have to find some sort of peace and solitude and let your mind play over that. At the beginning it sounds ridiculously abstract. But with all the merit and purification we've been doing, maybe our mind has become a little bit more subtle. There's no walker without legs. So just to be a walker, you're depending on something, your legs. Or you depend upon your heart, because that makes all the blood go around the body. So you couldn't even exist for a minute without your heart working, or some artificial machine that they have in a hospital. So you depend upon your heart. So you're entirely dependent just to be here, just do a simple act of walking, going. So then that sense of you being a goer from your own side then just sort of recedes. It just sort of disappears. And you're left having to admit that there's just voidness there. That's the only reality. Everything you look for as existing from its own side will just vanish under analysis. So all you're left with is no ultimate but voidness, that alone. But Nagarjuna says, dependent imputation, that itself is just the middle way. He's like forefronting the reasoning to realize emptiness. Emptiness is that, is like that voidness, it's like that sense of everything's vanished, so there are no more conceptual fabrications. You're just left face to face with the fact that nothing exists from its own side, which is a total void. It's the end of conceptual elaborations. But in this particular verse that Lama Zopa chose, Nagarjuna is forefronting the reasoning. Yeah? They are empty like that. That is the ultimate truth because of the power of the reasoning of dependent arising. So his dependent arising, that self is just the middle way, he's saying, at this point. Dependent arising, emptiness. Two sides, same coin. And then he says dependent imputation. And this is what Lama Zopa was saying in some of his remarks. So when you say, well, okay, I've looked at the goer and they just sort of vanished on me. When I said, now the goer's a goer, because they're depending on the act of going, then this sort of inherently existent goer that I sort of, subconsciously was grasping at, they're no longer there. So how does a person get to be a goer? Yeah, it's only by the recognition of them as a goer by the conceptual mind. Now that's really subtle, that's really difficult to even imagine. The only reason you're a goer is because you or somebody else is prepared to impute you. They're prepared to see you as a goer. But where else could the identification be coming from? If you aren't a goer by way of your own power, if you're a goer by way of your own substance, by way of your own nature, then you're just like, Saddam Hussein, he wasn't inherently evil, that's impossible. So he's only evil by us deciding that he's evil. So you're only a goer, you are only a goer by people identifying you as a goer, positing you as a goer. Imputing you as a goer. Do you have a good word for imputing in your native languages? Non-English speakers? I wonder what it would sound like. What's the French for imputing? Chantal? Same word? Oh well. Sister language, yeah, that's okay, French, you're okay. But it takes a lot of thought to see what that means. Again, like inherently, but we don't really have time to go into that now. But that's how you end up baffled. Well, if I don't exist from my own side at all, then even the fact that I'm a goer, that has to be, from a mental discrimination, a conceptual, sort of positing. Well, it must be. But you see how completely different that is from the way we normally assume things exist. So that's why Lama Zopa says, oh, you'll have such a shock. If you realize emptiness, it's more of a shock than what? Seeing a tiger? Meeting a tiger in the forest or something? Meeting a tiger on the road, yeah. Yeah, because it's so devastatingly different from the way you think things do exist. But actually, then he talks about those higher bodhisattvas, when they realize emptiness, of course, they're actually crying with happiness. It's not like it is really fearful. It's just when you first time you realize things are like that, then you're kind of really, the ground is disappears from under your feet. But actually, it's a very wonderful experience, which is very, more joyful than anything else you can think of, or whatever, So those are the types of thoughts we have to have. That's, I think, the way Lama Zopa is asking us to think. He talked a bit about the aggregates and the self being imputed independence upon the aggregates. But I think maybe we should stop there, or maybe have a question. I will just finish my own talk by referring back to Nagarjuna. After all, he's the main inspiration. So could we go back to Nagarjuna's verse 24? And we want verse 1, and I think verse 20. I think the verses are numbered, are they? Chapter 24, the Four Noble Truths, verse 1. Chapter 24, verse 1. Have we got that? 1. What does it say? Chapter 24, verse 1. The Four Noble Truths. Yeah, but we've got to... Yeah. But then we want to go to be able to go to verse 20, I think, so be ready to move, okay? So Nagarjuna here is dealing with the realists, those people who do insist that inherent existence, there is such a thing as inherent existence. Because if you don't have inherent existence, then everything just becomes so airy-fairy. Okay, translators, airy-fairy? Or we say Alice in Wonderland, if everything is just merely imputed by the mind, you will be like that story, Alice in Wonderland. Whatever she dreams up, appears in front of her. You know, if it's all imputed by mind, then you will meet the Queen of Hearts sitting on top of a mushroom or something, you know, when you walk out of the tent. So there are grave objections to the middle way system. Alice in Wonderland, I'm sure you've heard of that, even in China, yeah? I don't know where the Chinese translator is sitting. So these are the people who are determined to oppose Nagarjuna. These are the Buddhists with an amazing view of presentation of Four Noble Truths and everything like that. But Nagarjuna is telling them that you haven't quite got to the deep point yet. So I have to argue against you. But they're arguing against him. So they say, protesting against Nagarjuna's sort of apparently nihilistic kind of propositions, if they are void, then all of these, all the things of this world, and samsara and nirvana, if they are void, then all of these will not arise or pass away. You know, they'll just be like dreams, you know, they're just things you see in a dream. It's not like a sprout will arise from a seed. It was just like, oh, a sprout is there because you've just imputed it. You're just imagining it's there. So it doesn't need to arise from a seed, right? You know. If they are void, then all of these will not arise or pass away. For you, it follows, there will be no fourth truths of the noble ones. You know, the middle way system is so pathetic that, you know, once you adopt it, you cannot, you know, establish the Four Noble Truths anymore. Everything's just so, you know, airy-fairy, mere imagination. Okay, so now can we go to verse 20, I think it is, which is Nagarjuna's answer? Oh, yeah, great, that's exactly the right one. So here's how Nagarjuna eventually answers their protest. If they are not void, all of these will not arise or pass away. For you, it follows, there will be no fourth truths of the noble ones. So that's the beginning of the debate. Unless things are void, they can't be dependent arisings, and if they can't be dependent arisings, how can anything happen? So you lower schools have got it completely all wrong. So is the time for a question? Maybe 1, 2 questions. A lady wearing glasses.
Laetitia. Alors, je vais sortir de la vacuité. Je vais revenir au tout début de votre intervention concernant le karma. Vous avez parlé du karma collectif. J'ai un tout petit peu de difficulté à imaginer ce que c'est que le karma collectif. Comment, par exemple, dans un avion, quand un avion se scratch, toutes les personnes qui sont dans cet avion ont-elles semé la même graine pour qu'elles arrivent pour que les causes et les conditions mûrissent et qu'elles arrivent donc à se scratcher dans le même avion, par exemple. J'ai un petit peu de difficulté avec cette notion de karma collectif. Merci.
You want to translate?
Well, there's plenty of people who don't
translators.
speak English, don't speak French here, even if I did. Which I don't.
Vous traduisez le traducteur?
Oui, on peut le faire, oui.
Oui, vous le faites, d'accord.
Okay, so the question is, I have some trouble with the idea of a notion of collective karma, and especially when people are in a plane, and if the plane is crashing, and how come everybody has created the same karma to die at the same time? How is it possible that they have all sown the seed in a way so that the seed has ripened and all of a sudden, they crash, all of them crash at the same time? I have some difficulty understanding this idea of collective karma, how it is really possible. So can you answer about that?
Yeah, well, I wish I could take away your ignorance on that point. The suffering of your ignorance, that point, take it upon myself and give you the happiness of my wisdom, exchanging self and others. But I can't. Yeah, collective karma. It's but I think that would be like people's individual karma, wouldn't it? Like each person has created their own cause to die at that point. Yeah, and the fact that they're all dying simultaneously is just sort of incidental. I think what they mean by collective karma, the collective ripening result, like this world, we're all sharing. Yeah, the beautiful kind of grove of philosophy or whatever where we are now, and tantra. So that is somehow, the trees and the flowers and the nice weather and the fine house and the good food. So those things are collective, a result of collective karma. But I think you dying on that aeroplane is your individual karma. Yeah, so we all die simultaneously. So if we all die one after the other at different times, we all die together, then why is one more unusual than the other? Each are possible. One sometimes happens, the group dies together, or as often happens, people die individually one by one. But even while I'm dying in the world, when it happens, there'll be many other people dying simultaneously, won't there? But just in different places. Yes, any more? Anybody from this side? Anybody from the Sangha? Yeah. Yes, madam. Ketsuma. Chola. Kelongma. Sorry.
喂，很高兴认识法师哈。我有个问题，就是关于空性的问题哈，东巴尼的问题 ，about 东巴尼。昨天喇嘛曲巴里面讲到金刚身虽无生亦无死，是不是基于空性这个原理，然后更高于空性的正悟境界？请法师解释一下。关于喇嘛曲巴里面那个 about 喇嘛曲巴古鲁普哲里面那个金刚身虽无生亦无死是什么样的境界？请您解释一下啊！谢谢法师。Thank you, Venerable.
Thank you, Gelongmala.
Her question is about this one sentence in Lama Chöpa, where it says the Vajra body is neither birth nor death. So does it have to do with emptiness, or it is something that is higher than emptiness?
I think if you were explaining that in a straightforward way, you would say there's no sort of inherently existent death. There's no death which can be found from its own side. And the same with birth. There is no birth which can be found from its own side. Yeah? So the Vajra body is, well, maybe the Vajra body. Is that what it says, the Vajra body? So that's a Buddha body. Well,
It's talking about the guru doesn't have to pass away or be born.
yeah. So they're just doing it for a show, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's going more advanced than I was thinking. I was thinking more in terms of the Heart of Wisdom Sutra. So there's no suffering, there's no origination, there's no cessation, no path. What they mean is there's none of those things existing from their own side. But on the level of dependent imputation, mere dependent imputation, then we would accept that those things can be validly cognized. Sarah's probably giving a more sophisticated explanation, which is more appropriate to the text, when she says that the Vajra body, so that's the guru, let's say, they just put on a show of being born in this world and put on a show of dying out of this world, just in order to connect with us beings who haven't got the wit to imagine anything more wonderful. We haven't got the intelligence to understand that things could be different from that. How do they get to us? They have to be born amongst us as one of us. So that's they're not sort of being born and dying like we are. They're just manifesting it. Okay, so shall we stop there then? Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you.
And thank you to the translators. I hope I didn't give you a hard time. Okay, I've got to do dedication now. Well, may the opportunity to take a precious human rebirth in this world long continue. One has grave doubts, yeah? Like we've overspent our budget, there's a big overdraft. Really big. So it's not just our own individual lives we have to get used to, yeah? Mother Earth has her rhythms. And she will tip from ice age to hot age. And she's done that many times already in the billions of years in which life has existed on this earth. We fluctuated from ice to heat. This is the first time that we can hold a particular species responsible, maybe. But, in spite of all those vicissitudes, yeah, in spite of, in spite of it being payback time, may the Buddha's teachings long continue and people get the message. In a time of crisis, maybe it's more pointed then, so people do get down to business instead of being lazing around, dreaming about getting in line, but they actually get down and start working on it. So let's dedicate our merits to doing that while we have time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we can, before stopping, we can offer the food, bless the food and offer page 221.